Hello and welcome to this chess tips video. And so today, how to become good at chess, which is a pretty broad question. Um, you know, how good you become at chess is very much determined by how much you study and work at improving your chess and also your natural ability as well. But today I will cover a game by Magnus Carlsen, the greatest chess player in the world, and we'll see what he does and what we can learn from his game. And studying the best players in the world is one way to become good at chess, and learning from them. So I'll point out things as we go through this game that will help you to become good at chess. What are some of the things you can do to become good at chess? Play regularly. Play a little bit every day if you can. You can try quick games, like Blitz or even Bullet, I guess. But try to get some slow games in there as well, so you have time to think and not rush. Also, there are many tactics, strategies, end games that you can learn. There's just so much to learn to become good at chess. But don't be discouraged. Just learn one thing at a time. Where should you start? Tactics is a very good place to start to improve quickly, especially for beginners, but even more advanced players. You can always learn more tactics, study tactics more. All right, so in this game, Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces and he played with 93.9% accuracy versus 71.8% by his opponent. Let's see. He had one great move, Magnus Carlsen, and under my image here, you might not be able to see all this, but there was one inaccuracy, one mistake by Magnus Carlsen, but his opponent had four inaccuracies, one miss and one blunder. But Magnus Carlsen played at a 3,200 rating level versus 2,800 by his opponent. All right, so let me put on the computer analysis. This is another way you can become good at chess, is go over your own games after you play them. That is one way to really get better at chess and improve your game. And I would recommend first you just play back through the moves and try and figure out what you did wrong before you just plug it into a computer like this that highlights what the best moves are. All right, in this game, Magnus Carlsen plays e4. Okay, one way to become good at chess is to learn different opening principles and just chess principles in general that revolve around strategy and basically what to do and what not to do. So, if you have no idea where to begin and you're a total beginner, a good way to start would be with this e4 move because it allows the bishop to move here and develop because the pawn was blocking the bishop and the queen as well. But also importantly, this pawn controls the center, which is very important in chess. If you want to become good, you have to remember to try and control the center. You can do that by placing pieces in the center that cover squares in the center, like this pawn. The pawn is controlling this d5 square right here, but it is not really controlling the square that it's sitting on. You would have to bring in another piece to protect that. All right, anyway, let's see what Magnus Carlsen's opponent does. He plays e6. So this is called the French defense, and that's something else for you beginners out there. There are many different kinds of chess openings. Too many for you to try and memorize them all, and especially when you're starting out, I wouldn't worry too much about trying to memorize all the moves, in a specific opening. Maybe you could pick one move, like this e4 move, and then just figure out what you would do in a response to whatever your opponent does. So if you play e4 and they play e6, well, then you decide what would be a good move to play against that. Now, how would you do that? Well, you could, research online, look up the opening that you're facing. So if you learned that e4, e6 is the French defense, you could go online and, look up what good responses are against the French defense, and that would help you. You can, like I mentioned, you can use a computer to see what it recommends. Here it recommends d4. So a general opening principle or strategy is to control the center by placing both your pawns on d4 and e4 if your opponent allows you to do that. Now, if they attacked right away with d5, or excuse me, if they had played e5 instead of this e6 move, and then you move here, they'll just be able to take you. But then we get into different tactics, which, that is why you should definitely study tactics to become good at chess. All right, moving on here. Now we have b3 here with this pawn. Now, for beginners, maybe I wouldn't recommend a move like this because this move doesn't necessarily control these important central squares here. So these 4 squares here in the center are probably the most important area on the board, other than around your opponent's king, especially if you can get an attack against your king. Why are these squares so important? Well, if you control them and get your pieces into the center, from the center they can attack and move more quickly to anywhere else on the board. And so controlling the center will give you more freedom for your pieces to move and restrict your opponent's movements. All right, so now Magnus Carlsen's opponent responds with d5. So another way to become good at chess is ask yourself, after your opponent makes a move, well, even during your move as well, once a move is made, ask, well, what changed in the position? Now that this pawn has moved here, what is it doing? Why did my opponent play this move? And if you ask those questions, it'll help you figure out and hopefully avoid blunders. You'll see, oh, this pawn is attacking my pawn on e4, so maybe I need to do something about that. Now, we'll see what Magnus does here. And he is such a high-level player that he plays this and just gives up a pawn in the center. And usually that's not a good idea. But because this is such a great player and he's playing against a lower-rated opponent, he can take some chances here. And this was a 3-minute game, so in a quick game like that, usually it's good to sacrifice some material to get an attack going. But in general, you wouldn't want to just give up this pawn, and sure enough, the pawn is captured. And so this is an interesting variation, one that I've never even heard of. It's called the French defense Harrwitz Popaticulat Gambit variation. So you'll notice, especially you beginners out there, that there are many, many chess openings and variations of all the different openings. And if you think you're inventing a new opening by trying an unusual move, chances are that move has already been played at some point. All right, now why was this move played? Well, the bishop is on a good square here, firing up through the middle of the board here, controlling these 2 valuable dark squares in the center, and aiming here at this g-pawn. So if this bishop tries to move, white's bishop could capture the pawn and then go after this rook as well. And so to become good at chess, you also need to know the value of the pieces. So especially for beginners out there, A good estimate on the value of the pieces are that one bishop is worth about 3 pawns, a knight is worth 3 pawns, and a rook is more valuable. It's worth 5 pawns, and the queen is worth 9. And then what is the value of the king? Well, you don't really put too much of a value on the king because if you lose it, then the game's over, and you don't really lose the king. But if you're checkmated, all right. Continuing on here, let's keep moving. Now, another way to become good at chess is to develop your pieces quickly, get them into the game. Try not to move the same piece twice unless you don't have to. Now we see a disadvantage here to this pawn capture in the center. So once the pawn captured here, it kind of wasted time. Sure, you're ahead in material, but now Magnus Carlsen has a knight and a bishop developed already, and only 2 pawns are developed, and this one is pretty weak here. It's under attack by the knight. So the opponent develops a piece, so a good move, getting a piece developed, getting closer to maybe being able to castle on the king side here, and protecting the pawn. So the opponent did a good job asking, well, what did this knight move by Magnus Carlsen do? What did it change in the position? Well, it's attacking the pawn. And so if you ask that kind of question, it'll help you figure out what moves to play. So knight f6 is good to defend the pawn. And Magnus, here the computer says that he is playing a mistake in this move. G4, the computer says that is a mistake. That best would have been to just develop the queen immediately. But, like I said, this is a quick game, a 3-minute chess game, and Magnus is playing this move to hurry up and get an attack on the knight. So if you ask, why was this played by Magnus? Well, there's a threat of pushing forward here, attacking the knight, driving it away, and then allowing this pawn to be captured here in the center, perhaps. So what does Magnus's opponent do? He plays this h6 move, which prevents the pawn from going forward. But now this gives Magnus time to develop another piece. And the computer says that just developing another knight would have been better, knight to c6. But the game continues with queen to e2 here. So once again, I mentioned developing the pieces quickly, is a great way to become good at chess. We see that Magnus has 3 pieces developed. And when I say developed, I mean just getting the pieces off the back rank, especially the bishops, knights, and the queen. The rooks can stay on the back rank, but usually you want them connected. So you want to castle quickly with the king, and that brings one of your rooks closer to the center. And then once your rooks are connected to each other with no pieces in between, they kind of back each other up and protect each other, and they'll have more room to move from side to side. And then you can move your rooks in behind pawns that have been pushed forward, or an area where there is a half open or completely open file, which we'll see later. But moving on, finally another piece is developed instead of a pawn, and we have bishop to b4, an inaccuracy. Apparently, getting that other knight out is more important. And another way to become good at chess is to develop your knights in general. Now, all these principles, they can be broken if you have a good reason to break them. They're just guidelines, and you still have to look at the position and figure out what your opponent is doing and make decisions. And that's where you really become good at chess, just through experience, and you start to figure out how to make moves in any given position, and whether they're good or bad. So normally you want to bring your knights out first because they're slower to get them, moving and out into the action on the other side of the board or wherever the action is happening. The bishops, as you see, can zip across the board in one move. So a lot of times it's good to hold off on developing your bishops. That way your knights can get out first, and it gives you time to see where to put your bishops. But, I see that this move is probably played because black wants to get castled to safety here, perhaps. So, Magnus Carlsen, he castles to the queen side, and this is what I mentioned earlier. Once you castle and get your rooks towards the center, they do more than when they sit here in the corner. Now, also, before, if we go back, if this knight would have tried to move, there's a possibility, after knight captures, queen captures, well, then this bishop, or the queen, even worse, the queen could have swooped in here and tried to deliver a checkmate. So, what actually happens in the game before Magnus continues his capture or attack on this pawn here, he castles his king to safety. Now the rook is helping guard this pawn on d2. All right, so the opponent moves his queen backing up. He creates a battery. So another way to become good at chess is to use your pieces together, have them work together. You can create a battery like this where the queen and bishop protect each other, but more importantly, the queen is backing up the bishop, and this bishop may try to move here to a3 and attack this bishop, trading off a defender around the king. So Magnus doesn't want that to happen and moves his king over here to b1. So now, once this bishop moves and tries to trade off, well, now the bishop can just retreat. And why does Magnus do this? Well, this allows him to keep his bishop pair, because a bishop pair is pretty strong, especially because the bishops, if you have both of them, they cover all the squares on the board. But once you get rid of one, so if these two bishops would have traded each other, then there would be weak, dark squares around Magnus's king, and that might give something for Magnus's opponent to target later in the game by going, attacking these weak squares. And that's something, if you're not really understanding the subject of weak squares, especially for beginners, that's something you'll learn as you play more. Another way to become good at chess is do a little research online. If there's a topic you don't understand, Google it, look it up online, watch videos. You can become, a lot better at chess by watching different videos online, such as this one that just points out things that you may not know yet. And you can go over games like this with Magnus, some of the best players in the world. Now, modern chess players, they're a little bit more complicated and harder to understand, especially when they have powerful computers helping them, come up with certain variations and attacks. Chess is more complicated these days, so you may want to start, especially if you're a beginner, start by studying games of older chess masters when their play wasn't quite as complicated. So, Magnus's opponent, Alberto here, pushes forward with this pawn, trying to open up lines to the king and create some type of attack. So Magnus, he ignores this attack on the edge of the board and counters in the center. So that is a good strategy usually, is if there's an attack on the flank or the sides of the board like this, a good counterattack in the center is, many times a good way to go, as long as this, counterattack on the side, or excuse me, the original attack on the side is not so dangerous that it's going to checkmate your king. So you kind of have to, that's where a little bit of calculation comes in. All right, so some pieces are exchanged here. And if we look at the position, we have, it's kind of changed here. Now Magnus's opponent has 2 pieces developed. Magnus has a queen developed. Now his bishop, even though it's on the corner here, I would say that it's still developed because it's targeting, well, first it's protecting these squares around the king. It's targeting the central squares here, which are important. And it's attacking here, on G7 and all the way up through to the rook here. So the game continues with this plan of pushing the pawn forward to A4 and trying to break open the king side, or excuse me, the queen side, but that's where the king is located. And for you beginners, if you're not sure what I mean by king side or queen side, well, the king side is the half of the board that the king starts out on, and the queen side is the side where the queen starts out in the beginning of the game. All right, so, what does Magnus do here? He's under fire here on the area around his king. Well, he ignores that and just continues with his attack. So grabbing a pawn, and Magnus is still behind here, it looks like, by 1 pawn. But now he has a counterattack going, and he's targeting this rook, and that is ignored, and a blunder is made by Magnus's opponent. Now, it looks like Magnus has 2:50 left on the clock out of 3 minutes, and his opponent is down under 2 minutes already. So, maybe his opponent is trying to hurry up a little bit, and because he's behind on the clock, and he's just trying to break things open and get an attack going. But this apparently is a blunder. So to become good at chess, you really have to try and work on your calculation and figure out, if I make a move like this, before you make a move, ask yourself what the position will look like after you make that move. So then if you can think in your head, if you can think in your head, all right, once I capture this pawn, what will my opponent do? Well, that's where it gets tricky, and you just have to practice by doing tactical problems, working on that, doing puzzles, read books, watch videos, just learn your tactics, and then practice your calculation. So here, perhaps Magnus's opponent just thought Magnus would recapture this pawn. But instead, Magnus plays the best move, going up by a whole rook here. So now we have pawn captures with a check. So this looks pretty dangerous, but it's not quite as dangerous as it looks here. The king moves to A1 here. And why does he do this? Okay, you don't want to go after this pawn because then the rook will be lined up on your king. The bishop could move out of the way, creating a discovered attack on your king. So this is a great move by Magnus because he uses his opponent's own pawn as a defensive shield. so the rook cannot attack him. So the queen cannot come in here and try and threaten a mate because it'll just be picked off by the rook, or excuse me, by Magnus's queen. So now Magnus's opponent is just down in material. So if you want to become good at chess, once you get a lead by going ahead in material like this, you have to figure out, what to do next. What should you do after that? Well, once you're ahead in material, you want to trade off more pieces in the position, because if all the pieces are traded off, and when I say pieces, I mean everything except the pawns, and the kings, of course. But once you trade off all the pieces, white would just have an extra rook at the end, and then he could use that rook to pick off his opponent's pawns and help promote his own pawns to a queen. Now, to stop that promotion of a pawn to a queen, the person who's behind in material should try and go ahead and trade off pawns. Because if all the pawns are traded off, and then all the pieces are traded off, well, in this case, a rook and a king could win. But sometimes you'll be down by a knight or a bishop. And a knight and a king versus a lone king, or a bishop and a king versus a lone king is not enough to win. All right, let's see how this game ended here. A knight here is finally developed, and now we have Magnus just developing his other bishop. So this is a good tactic here, and you definitely want to learn about this tactic if you're going to become good at chess. This is a pin where the bishop is pinning this knight to the king, making it illegal for this knight to move. And there's also this threat of capturing the knight, and then if the pawn captures, the queen could recapture with check, and then perhaps maybe pick off this rook. So that's one possibility, and so you have to calculate these tactics, and that's why I say tactics are so important. The more tactics and problems you study and practice, the better you'll get at calculating the moves. All right, so the pin is broken here, and the knight is defended. So Magnus just starts developing the rest of his pieces, bringing this knight up, and now his opponent tries to centralize the queen, targeting this unprotected bishop. So what does Magnus do now? Magnus tries to trade off queens. As I mentioned, if you are ahead in material, you want to trade off more pieces. And the opponent does not want to do that and make it easier for Magnus to win. So he goes over here and picks up a free pawn. So now Magnus has a rook, but his opponent has 2 extra pawns. But Magnus is still ahead by +3, the equivalent of 3 pawns. This knight is under attack. So the final piece that wasn't doing anything, the other rook here that was on h1, moves over to the half-open file. Remember, I said rooks are better placed in half-open files. And for beginners, if you don't know what a half-open file is, that's where one of the pawns are missing on this F file. So the white pawn is gone, and the rook can fire up the board, maybe targeting this F pawn. The queen moves to the side. And now let's look at the position again. Well, Magnus has all his pieces pretty much developed. Now this rook here is a little bit blocked in behind this pawn, but it is centralized. And The knights developed, the bishops. Um, the queen is kind of out of play over here in the corner compared to Magnus's queen in the center. So another way to become good at chess is to try and make your piece better than your opponent's equivalent piece. And what do I mean by that? Well, look at the two queens. This queen is kind of stuck in the corner, blocked in by the knight. It's really limited on what it can do and where it can go. Sure, it could move here, but then what? It can't move up here or here because of the knight and pawn. So it looks really bad for this queen compared to Magnus's queen, which is, kind of in the center, controlling some central squares. It's kind of aimed up here towards where the king is in the center. And as I mentioned, castling earlier, I mentioned try to castle early, castle quickly to get your king to safety. If we look here, his king can only be attacked head on by this rook or from the side here. Nothing can come from off the board on the other side here. And now if we compare Magnus's king, which only can be attacked from two different directions, versus the opponent's king, which can be attacked from head on, the left or the right. So by castling, it gets your your rook into the game towards the center more, and it gets your king into a safer position. All right, looking at the rest of the pieces, we have a bishop here, which is kind of attacking the king's side, but it's on the edge of the board. So our bishop is on the edge of the board as well, but at least it's controlling the center. And now the other bishop is attacking, and this one's more passively defending, and it's blocked by its own colored pawn here. So this is a bad bishop versus this better light squared bishop of Magnus's. So how does the game continue? Magnus just tries to trade off more material. So he jumps his knight up here, giving up this pawn that his opponent could capture, but he's targeting these pieces, the defenders of the king. So we have capture, which is best, capture by the bishop, and now this pawn is protected. And what next? Well, we have this c6 move. Apparently, queen to d5 would have been better, trying to slow down the attack. One way to get better at chess is if you're really under attack, you might want to try and trade some pieces off to lighten the attacking power of your opponent. Even here you don't want to trade material off, but it looks like according to the computer, queen to d5 by black would have been the best move here to try and target the bishop along with this bishop, and the queens would probably be traded off. But in the game, we have this c6 move thinking, oh, well, what now? The bishop has to retreat. What does Magnus do? Oh, excuse me. Instead, he offers to just give that bishop up, and he threatens an attack. So this is one way to really become good at chess, is to figure out how to ignore your opponent's plans. Now, you can't always do that, and that's where just chess practice comes in. The more you play, you'll figure out how and when you can ignore what your opponent is doing, like this attack by the pawn on the bishop, and instead counterattack. So Magnus is counterattacking over here, threatening to check the king. The king would have to run, and then you could get maybe a bishop into the game, or you could just jump up here and deliver a mate, is really what Magnus is going after. So let's say the opponent, well, first we'll see what he did. He castles here, and that's an inaccuracy. Apparently, f5 would be best to try and block this battery because, if the bishop were captured like this, well, then we have this move with check. The king would try and run here, to the only square it can go to. And now, let's see, it looks like the best move is actually rook to f3, and then the queen would have to capture. But, you have a lot of threats brewing here. But the rook moving up and then maybe swinging over here and trying to threaten a checkmate is one option. But I'm not going to go into all the different variations that are possible because let's just continue this here and finish out what happened in the game. So there's a threat of an attack here against the king. Castling is played, and this is an inaccuracy. It would have been better to push this pawn forward here and try and block this battery. But now the position has changed. And remember, after each move, if you have time, if you're playing a blitz game, you might not have all the time in the world, but try to ask what changed in the position. So Magnus notices that now the king is over here in the corner. This bishop is covering these squares around the king. And so Magnus swoops his queen over, attacking this bishop, but more importantly, threatening to move up here and deliver a mate. So there's a mate in 4, there's a possible mate in 2. If this bishop moves, well then, let's see, queen to a8. And then what? The king would have to move. I could show you that one, so let's take a look at it. And this is a way to become better at chess. Practice little checkmate puzzles. So let's take a look at what could have happened here. If, we see that there's a threat of a mate in 1 here. So if this move is played, bishop to e8 to give the king an escape hatch, well then you have queen check. The king runs for its life. But it doesn't matter because the queen can deliver a mate here and the bishop helps cut any escape off. So that is one way that the game could have ended. A little better resistance would be, let's see, the bishop is under attack, maybe bishop to d6, trying to block the path of the bishop. But, you can just go here. And then what? King up to c7. Queen to a5. So this is a little trickier. b6 blocks that, but then we have check. The king moves up to c8. And then this type of checkmate. So this will really help you become good at chess if you study these different types of checkmates, and try and figure out how you could use them in your own games. So if we go back here, in the game, the other option is, let's see, bishop to b2 check. So check. The king could go ahead and take that. Then we have queen, but now it allows the rook to capture. Now this rook that wasn't doing anything is on an open file. Bishop to e8. So once again, an escape hatch is made, but the queen comes up here to attack. the king goes to d7, and once again, capture with mate. All right, so some of the ways that you can become good at chess. A little recap here. Study tactics, study checkmate problems. You can do that by reading books, solving puzzles, watching videos, go over the games of the greatest players to see how they conduct attacks and checkmate their opponents. So tactics, study tactics a lot when you're starting out if you want to become good at chess. Then learn strategy. So, there's so many tips and different things you can do for strategy in chess and stuff you just have to learn over time. Same thing, watch videos, go over games, go over your own games. Try and figure out what you did wrong after each game. First, do it without a computer and then use the computer to see what you missed. But as far as strategy, there's opening, middle game, and end game strategy. So, there's so much. I'll just touch on a few. In the opening, there's general opening principles that you can learn. Such as control the center of the board, get your pieces developed quickly, castle early, and often, try and get castled quickly because then your king is only able to be attacked from 2 different directions instead of 3 if you leave your king in the center. What else? I'll have to do, more videos in the future to cover more. So, middle game strategy, you can try to get your pieces developed better than the equivalent piece of your opponent. So if all of your pieces are just a little better placed than your opponent's pieces, that should give you an advantage and help you win. And what do I mean better? Well, give your pieces more freedom to move and more squares to move to and try and block in your opponents. So try and improve your pieces and at the same time restrict or make your opponent's pieces worse by not giving them many options, as far as where to go. All right, the end game, we didn't really go into much of an end game here, but that's something that's pretty important. If you have an option between studying openings and end games, I would say for the opening, just pick one move to start with, like e4 or d4. But e4 is good because there's usually more tactics when you bring your pawn, like the beginning of this game, like Magnus moved his pawn here to e4. You can usually attack more and learn more about tactics with e4 as opposed to bringing this other pawn up here to d4. So, yes, go ahead and learn one opening for white and one for black as far as the openings are concerned. So you can play e4 and then just figure out what response you'll play to each of your opponent's moves. And as far as openings, just try and go one move further each time. So let's say the opponent moved here. Well, now you want to figure out, all right, I know if my opponent plays this move, that I'm going to play this. Now, this is a little more complicated for a beginner. You probably want to start out with d4 against the French defense. But as an example, once your opponent goes here, well, now you know that, in this position, I'm going to go here. And you just try and go a little bit deeper each game and each time, as you're learning more. All right, that's what I would do for openings. Just try and do one move for white, figure out what you'll do against black's responses, and then pick one move against the different openings by white, and just stick with those for at least 4 months, 6 months, or more until you improve at them. If you're trying all different kinds of openings all the time, it's going to be more complicated and harder to figure out what you're doing right or wrong. So, Openings versus end games. If you want to become good at chess, I would definitely recommend putting more time into end games. As long as you get your openings down okay, so you're not getting blown off the board. As you do that, you're going to see more and more games that are going into the middle game and the end game. And you should learn the basic end games, like what to do if you're ahead by a rook and a king versus a lone king, two rooks versus a king, the queen and the king versus the king, etc. You just want to know these basic chess end games because you don't want to be winning a game and then not know how to finish the win off in the end. All right, what else? Just play regularly, a little bit every day if you can. That'll help you become good at chess. And feel free to leave comments and let me know about your own chess journey. What you would like to see as far as videos in the future that would help you, help you become good at chess. But like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. And thank you for watching and have a super chess day.